The super slaps the door of 12A with his big hand. But I just gave you $60. Nobody's ever squeezed me for more than 60. He's having trouble keeping his trembling arms still at his chest. No, he wouldn't mind taking a swipe at her. You place $60 in my pocket. I don't think I implied by my behavior that I wanted you to bribe me, nor have I made any statement or gesture, such as an outstretched palm, for example, saying that I would change my report because you gave me money. If you want to give away your hard-earned money, Lila May waves her hand towards a concentration of graffiti. I see it as a curious, although in this case fortuitous, habit of yours that has nothing whatsoever to do with me, or why I'm here.
The empty chair. What does it mean, the empty chair? The same chair I am sitting in. Jesse's empty chair and microphone. Jesse Duke sits in a neutral location with a Herman Miller Aeron chair and exquisite toned microphone.
The microphone is not lacking for exquisiteness of design and purpose. Are you being Colson Whitehead? Are you Colson Whiteheading me?
I realized as I was saying that, I was aiming first for Richard Foreman, the director of Ontological Hysterical, a theater company in New York City, who would often heckle his own actors from the audience with a microphone and a PA system, like playing wild sound cues that they weren't prepared for and saying things like, I wonder what I'm going to do next, as they performed the plays in front of them.
That sounds very annoying.
It was awesome.
Oh, really?
It was great because everybody knew that was going to happen. He would sort of punctuate performances with the sounds of like shattering glass. It was. I don't know if he's still alive. I don't know if Ontological Hysterical is still going. They sort of squatted in St. Mark's Cathedral for like 25 years or something. They're part of that downtown experimental theater scene with like the Worcester Group, which is awesome, where you could go and see like Willem Dafoe in like wildly experimental theater pieces like a week after seeing him in, Speed 2.
Right. I think I've heard him talk about that a little bit, maybe on like the WTF podcast or Bullseye or something like that. Yeah, I'm in a new, very neutral location.
I know. It's like I feel like I'm speaking to you in some sort of office setting.
I've been doing a lot of travel, so I just kind of got back into town last night, and the people I'm house sitting for just took the train to New York, where they are going to take the Queen Elizabeth II to England.
What?
And then be gone.
Oh my God! No way.
Yeah, don't tell their kids. It's a surprise. The kids that like
okay,
kids are like 14
we'll edit that
and
out
16.
too.
Well, in the like 6 weeks it takes to produce this episode, they'll be back.
They'll have gone and returned.
They'll have gone and returned. Exactly.
Oh my God, that's amazing. I didn't know that was something you could still do, and that's rad.
Yeah, apparently, and it's still the Canard line or Canard, I believe. Yeah, they still run.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know when the Queen Elizabeth II was built, but I'm guessing in the 50s or so. I think it in and of itself is now a grand old ship, because the Queen Elizabeth I, I know, was used as a troop transport ship in the World War II, and it was basically like it could go 40 knots, so they didn't worry about submarines, because like they didn't have airplanes that could bomb it then, and by the time the submarines could figure out where it was they were much too slow to torpedo it.
Nice. I didn't know that. I know there's an episode of The Queen that sort of dramatizes. I'm trying to remember which season of The Queen it was, and there's an episode about the decommissioning of one of the Queen Marys. And I don't know which one. So
I think both Queen Marys were decommissioned, because the Queen Mary Actually, this came up in another Upper Middlebrow episode, and I incorrectly said that it was permanently anchored at San Diego. It is, in fact, permanently anchored in Long Beach, another lovely Southern California port of call. And and so the Queen Elizabeth, there was a QE1. There might be, I don't know how many Queen Marys there were. I would guess it was the Queen Elizabeth too, since the crown is about Queen Elizabeth, and it would be
right.
a bigger
I was wondering.
deal.
I was like, that would be weird if it was the Queen. Yeah. So maybe it was the Queen Elizabeth I getting dramatized, being decommissioned sometime in the 80s, which I feel like makes kind of sense. Maybe like 70s, like late 70s, early 80s. I don't know. I mean, where in the world would we find all this information?
I was just gonna say, like, if only we had.
It's probably in the
device.
same place where you learn how to pronounce Stephen Schock's last name. That was awesome. that little addition. You were like, I didn't get it right any of the times.
Right. And to my credit, listener, I could have cut out all of those feeble attempts to pronounce his name, but in the interest of transparency and humor, I let poor Jesse of the past during the taping flail in his attempt to pronounce Stephen Schock for the sake of the enjoyment of Jesse of the future. It's like the opposite of when, or the present. It's like the opposite of when you stay up too late and party too hard. You're sort of punishing your future self when you do that, and then I'm instead punishing my past self.
Yeah. The Maddox one, like when you said Doug Maddox, I was like, Doug Maddox? I was like, is there another Maddox? And I was like, well, Jesse's a lot better with his like baseball people than I am. I'm just gonna roll with that. Like, I have weird substitution things that my brain will do, where I know who the person is and I'll know what the word is. Also, the fact that I continually referred to the College World Series as the World Series of Baseball too, which is like, in my head, I'm mashing up the College World Series and the World Series of Poker, because in my head, the World Series of something is the proper kind of prefix phrase that you use when you're like, it's not really the World Series, but then calling it the World Series of Baseball is a sort of funny. it's like the definition of a tautology. Yeah, like,
it is.
It's like the Baseball World Series of Baseball.
Exactly.
Is where we're at. A phrase that wouldn't be out of place in the book that we're considering today. I didn't realize when I was doing my Jesse's chair bit when you weren't there, until you said, "Are you being Colson Whitehead?" I was like, I really am sort of speaking quite a bit like the narration of this book.
Anybody who could really, though, render the narration of this book off the cuff, unrehearsed, would be a genius.
Holy shit! It's impossible.
Yeah, like you can maybe imitate it in the same way that somebody can imitate a Scottish accent and summon the idea of a Scottish accent, but it would take a literary genius to simply speak Colson Whitehead. Every sentence is a kind of literary, poetic triumph, or many of the sentences are. There is a tremendous amount of micro-level craft, I think, in this book.
I had to stop adding book darts to my book because it was getting too heavy.
Yeah, no, I definitely was like, oh, that's the excerpt I'm going to prepare. Oh, no, wait, no, that's the excerpt I'm going to prepare.
And I was like, you know what? For my reading, I'm going to open the book at random and pick a section, and it's going to be
great. Well, should we get into it? Do you have any other business before the court today?
That's funny. My trivia does involve some court action, but none before a judicial court. Well, let's get going. We're talking today on Upper Middlebrow about Colson Whitehead's 1999 debut novel, The Intuitionist. This was one of your selections from our draft. This rounds out our series Black SFAF, where we have looked at Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Sower, N.K. Jemison's the fifth season, and now Colson Whitehead's The Intuitionist. I'm intrigued. What made you go and reach for this book in the first place?
I have read at least one or two Colson Whitehead short stories, and I have read his most recent novel, Harlem Shuffle, which I really liked. I have been meaning to read The Nickel Boys and The Underground Railroad for some time, but I haven't done it because they both seem like a bummer. And I should. And in fact, now I think I'm all the more motivated to. But I don't know. I was looking for black science fiction, and I was kind of looking at some lists, and this one was kind of a fun outlier to me because it's his first novel. He's pretty well regarded, but he is not thought of as a speculative fiction writer, really, even though some of his, The Underground Railroad clearly has elements of science fiction to it, as I understand it. And it had that, there wasn't that much about it out there compared to how much I've heard about Colson Whitehead. And so to me, it just felt sort of fun to go back to the beginning. It's his first novel of a pretty well-established novelist. And I had the sense in reading the plot recap that it was a kind of pastiche, a sort of noir pastiche, and I liked that. The description of it, I found it very striking, and it suggested to me that it would be kind of its own lovely self-contained world, much like Jonathan Letham's The Arrest, and I would say that had proved exactly correct. So, it was just a little bit of a Googling around and being sort of like, that sounds great, let's read that. I knew that Colson Whitehead was a writer with tremendous talent and power, and I think of him as in sort of a pack with James McBride and maybe even Walter Mosley, sort of like three middle-aged black writers who are all very talented. And of the three, he's always seemed like they're all brilliant and inventive and funny and interesting in their own ways, but Colson Whitehead's sentences just seem delicious and
oh my God, yeah, that's a great word for them.
And I mean, maybe Letham's got some of it. Michael Chabon, similar sort of sentence level brilliance. Going back a ways, like Melville,
Yeah,
maybe,
totally.
Maybe Dickens. In fact, I feel like that sort of wry understatement, such that things are sort of understated in almost a genteel way that gives you this sort of dark brilliance of it. And that's in other books of his that I've read. So yeah, that's my basic answer to that question.
Yeah, I'm very excited to talk about it. Like you texted me last week, this book is a delight. And I was like, yes, this book is a delight, and I'm excited to chat.
It is a delight, and I would say it is, even though it is, it concerns, I think, similar spiritual and social criticisms as N.K. Jemisin and as Octavia Butler. I find it more fun than those two books. I'll just start our recap here, which is to say that our protagonist is Lila Mae Watson, and she is an elevator inspector for a major northeast metropolitan city that is completely recognizable as New York, although I believe that is never said.
Right.
She seems to live in Harlem, and that is never said. It is simply described.
Yeah.
We do know that it is the most famous city in the world, and there are tunnels from New Jersey to the city. So I can't think of another major city that has tunnels to New Jersey that I'm aware of. And there's something about the New York of I haven't read the book, but the New York of Motherless Brooklyn, like late 1940s, early 1950s. I don't know if we're ever given a date, but my guess is early 1950s, given sort of the language and some of the pop culture references. We're clearly after World War II, but we're not quite into the 1960s yet. And so Lila Mae Watson is an elevator inspector, and we learn very quickly that she is an intuitionist, and that there is a kind of schism among elevator inspectors in New York. And whatever the elevator inspector bureau is, it's called something like the Bureau of Elevator Inspection or Elevator Safety or something. It's a municipal office that goes around and inspects the elevators in apartment buildings and office buildings. And some of the elevator inspectors are intuitionists, and some of them are empiricists. And empiricists, they have a number of very objective tests that they do to ascertain the condition of an elevator, whereas an intuitionist does something like magic, maybe, or maybe it's something more like a doctor listening to somebody breathing and being able to hear a thrombosis or a hearing an aortic aneurysm from the sound of the heart. It's a little bit unclear whether this is magic or whether this is some kind of human capacity to imagine the elevator as a complete system, and by listening and touching and probing, sensing without even entering the elevator shaft what might be right or wrong about this particular elevator. But she's very much an intuitionist. She's been trained at, what was it, the Midwest Institute of Vertical Studies or something like that. Which is
like the most prestigious institute or higher learning for elevator. I mean, like, yeah, we're going to talk more about this.
There is a lovely whole infrastructure of elevator technology and knowledge, largely fictitious, a investigative magazine about the trade of elevation
Lift,
and
called
elevation.
Lift.
Lift.
Love it.
And so, and very quickly we go from fun and games to a problem. We see her kind of doing what she's doing, but within the first chapter, we learn that something has gone wrong, and that an elevator that she inspected went into free fall. And nobody was harmed, but this was in City Hall, or kind of something like City Hall, in a building named after
Fanny Briggs Memorial Building.
The Fanny Briggs Memorial Building.
Yeah, which is a nod. It's a token nod. It's the one government building in this particular city that has been named after a black person, and in order to maybe perhaps secure the vote of the black, or in this book they're called colored, vote of the elevator inspector unions.
One of my readings is a sort of description of the politics of that. Fanny Briggs being a kind of strong analog for Harriet Tubman. So that's our inciting incident. Lila Mae Watson, and very quickly Lila Mae figures out essentially that, first of all, this is fishy because she's very good at her job. We're made to understand, and elevators very rarely have a total free fall collapse. If they fail, there's all sorts of safeguards. So it just feels like something is wrong, and one of our antagonists, Mr. Kenker, the head of the guild and also sort of the chief empiricist, is running to be president of the elevator guild, and he is using this incident as a way to kind of stick it to the Intuitionists in a way, and sort of suggest that because not only was this elevator inspector a woman, and a colored, quote unquote colored woman at that, which are two strikes against her, but she also was an intuitionist. So he seems to be using this for political gain, and there's some insinuation that he may have even, set her up and caused the accident. That's our inciting incident. Do you want to sort of talk about our other major characters a little bit? Or go
sure.
into...
You've got this bullet point in here about intuitionists versus empiricists, which
Sure.
I think we've covered. But yeah, like you said, intuitionists just are the stand-in for the feeling crowd. I think this book really this book has a real 18th century analog in terms of the divide between the Enlightenment and the Romantics. I think that's one of the conflicts that's lurking behind here, of basically Newton versus Byron is kind of what is kind of the parallel here.
It's interesting though, because I also see it as a kind of maybe metaphor for race, and maybe a metaphor for kind of working knowledge versus sort of empirical positive knowledge that you can prove.
And particularly the empiricists also seem to stand in for the kind of toxic, if it can't be measured, it can't be managed.
Right.
And you can also really you can see how the seeds of that particular way of thinking has showed up in our own particular political climate with whataboutisms and all sorts of very bad false dichotomies that are very often dispersed in the spirit of racial controversy.
Right. And we should say Lila Mae Watson is not the first black elevator inspector, but the first black woman.
Yes.
And actually, we can start listing our other major characters. We have Mr. Reed, who is not the leader of the Intuitionists, but maybe sort of like the man. He's technically works for the leader, whose name is Orville Lever, but we have the sense that he's
Carl
the brains.
Rove.
Yeah,
he's
he's
like
the brains of the operation.
The Carl Rove.
Yeah, strategist, and also a little bit of enforcement too. He sort of like Karl Rove mixed with the lawyer who sort of shows up with and says, "Can I see the warrants, boys? Your warrants are not in order." There's Mr. Kenker, we already mentioned, who is running for president of the guild, the empiricist. There's Pompey, who was the first black elevator inspector, and I can't remember if he is ever referred to explicitly as a, quote, Uncle Tom, but he is described as painfully obsequious and somewhat pitiable, but also morally compromised, perhaps. He does not appear to be on Lila Mae's side.
He is the figure that, like when you want to foment racial division, he is being used as, he is kind of pitted against the other black character, Lila Mae, by the rest of this organization, which is almost exclusively like non-black. But yeah, he fills that space of finding ways to keep other groups of people fighting each other rather than being able to unite for some sort of common purpose, which really does seem to keep coming up in this book.
Yeah, and I would say that there's a tremendous personality difference between him. And in fact, my first reading sort of lays out Lila Mae's character and her approach to things more generally. We have Chuck Gould, and I'm not sure we ever hear that he is Jewish, but Gould is quite often a Jewish name, and it would make sense. He's sort of Lila Mae's one ally, and he is an escalator man, not an elevator man, which makes him sort of literally a redheaded stepchild in the department. And, there's also a sense that because maybe he's Jewish, it's sort of like what we were talking about with the talented Mr. Ripley, that he's not entirely waspy. So he's riding coach class in the white boat, that to some degree maybe he has experienced some ethnic prejudice, and maybe that gives him something in common with Lila Mae too. And he just seems like a straight up good guy as well. We have James Fulton, who is deceased, but is the dean of elevator inspectors and something of an intellectual hero to Lila Mae, and kind of a theorist, somebody who taught and wrote very arcane things about elevators and elevator inspection. There's Natchez, who is a handsome young black man who appears to be working at Intuitionist House, which is a kind of mansion where the Intuitionists sort of have their seat of power, but he's mysterious, and his story is a little bit thin. And we don't know, is he mysterious because he's romantically attracted to Lila Mae, or is he mysterious for other reasons? Not quite sure. President. Oh, and I should mention there's also the woman who inherited James Fulton's house and property.
Right, and his papers.
His papers.
Very important aspect and very funny section about the dust-up between the Institute and James Fulton, and trying to get a handle on his diary, which becomes important plot-wise because this book very quickly turns into a fetch quest. We're after a MacGuffin. The missing diary pages of James Fulton, who apparently was working on something called a black box. That sounds like... I love the descriptions of it. It sounds like an elevator that can convey people through the air without really existing in a physical place.
It's Willy Wonka's Great Glass Elevator.
Exactly.
It is an elevator designed from an elevator's perspective. It is as if the elevator had the power. There's something arcane about James Fulton's relationship to elevators. So there is this idea that perhaps he designed an elevator that will make all the current elevators superficial, unimportant, of the past, that will transcend the current elevators. And given that this is an election year, James Fulton was very much an Intuitionist. So if this is true, it would be a real feather in the cap for the Intuitionists in their conflict with the empiricists. And yes, so everybody wants this, including the antagonists. I'm going to just do a quick reading. This is from pretty early on, but I like this because it kind of establishes Lila May's character pretty early on. This is in the first chapter. So she is inspecting an elevator in an apartment building, and she is determined that there's something wrong with it, and she's told the superintendent this. The superintendent thinks she's shaking him down for a bribe. And right before this passage has tucked $60 into her breast pocket, thinking that she wants a bribe. The super slaps the door of 12A with his big hand. But I just gave you $60. Nobody's ever squeezed me for more than 60. He's having trouble keeping his trembling arms still at his chest. No, he wouldn't mind taking a swipe at her. You placed $60 in my pocket. I don't think I implied by my behavior that I wanted you to bribe me, nor have I made any statement or gesture, such as an outstretched palm, for example, saying that I would change my report because you gave me money. If you want to give away your hard-earned money, Lila May waves her hand towards a concentration of graffiti, I see it as a curious, although in this case fortuitous, habit of yours that has nothing whatsoever to do with me, or why I'm here. Lila May starts down the stairs. After riding elevators all day, she looks forward to walking downstairs. If you want to try and take your $60 off me, you're welcome to try. And if you want to challenge my findings and have another person double-check the overspeed governor, that's your right as a representative of this building. But I am correct. Lila May abandons the super on the 12th floor with the Arbo Smooth Glide. The super cusses. She's right about the overspeed governor. She's never wrong. She doesn't know yet. Which is how the chapter ends.
There's so much about this book that is just damn good. I think I kind of want you to talk about this section as combined with like my next question.
Sure.
And which my next question was about like how do we get situated in this world? And this reading is like early enough. And I wanted to ask you, what was your experience of beginning to realize what this world entailed and what was in it? And how does this particular passage evince this world for you?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what the first paragraph was, which I'm not remembering right now. So I'm going to actually take a quick look. Because this is not too far in, but I'm not sure if it's the very first scene. It might be. She doesn't know what to do with her eyes for this movie to skirt and go. Okay, yeah. This is the first scene. So the very first thing that she's doing is going to this building, and she's reading the log of other elevator inspectors, like reading it and people who've come before her. And that is very much world building. Very quickly we're getting the sense of who she is and what she is doing, which is inspecting the elevator in this building. She's working for an organization or an agency, a bureaucratic agency that's doing that. And, we're getting the description of the elevator, we're getting the description of the building, we're getting these very arcane descriptions of things like overspeed governors, which I'm not even sure if that's a real thing or not. There's a lot of elevator technical jargon that may or may not have come out of trade magazines. So all that's happening, but then you're also getting this kind of yawning expanse of inspectors, the routine of elevator inspection. That this is something that happens from time to time, that there's different elevator inspectors, that some of them look for certain types of things like stress or certain, I think she says this one elevator inspector has this one thing that he always looks for. And then, of course, in this scene, you get the sense that it's not uncommon for elevator inspectors to kind of shake down building supers for a bribe, that there's a kind of rigmarole. And very quickly we learn that Lila May is outside of that. I think we learn very quickly that she's black, that she's a woman, that she is maybe the first black woman to have this position, that she is not corrupt. She's not asking for a bribe, nor would she accept a bribe. But at the same time, she's also not entirely ethical either, that because she does not return the $60, which might be the strictly most ethical thing to do, and that there's a sense in which that she's not going to be corrupted, but at the same time, she's going to take whatever edge she can get. And in this case, this man has put $60 in her pocket. And, you know, as she says, you may try to remove it, which I don't know exactly what she's suggesting, but one senses is that she also is something of a physical fighter. She's formidable. Mm-hmm. She's not physically intimidated by men. And that comes up later. And that she's entering the world with a kind of almost preemptive belligerence, that it's not to say that her conduct is rude or not correct, but at the same time, she is not going to back down from a confrontation, and I don't think we see her do that. So that's all. Those are all the things I'm seeing, and I feel like we're getting the world very, very quickly.
Yes. Yeah, that was why I asked this question.
I feel like within the first chapter, we sort of know her world. I mean, partly that it's recognizable, right? Like if you've read Motherless Brooklyn, if you've read Raymond Chandler or Dashiell Hammett novels or watched the movies that were made from them, those were maybe more in LA, but we're in kind of that same sort of 1940s, 1950s, maybe 1960s corrupt crime novel with grimy offices and bureaucracies and people shaking down bribes and, people, being kind of oppressed by their superiors and complaining about their dumb luck and, getting intelligence and information from their one buddy in the department. We're in that world so very quickly. And it's familiar.
A world where the mob, instead of controlling the waste disposal, the mob controls the contracts for the elevator inspections.
They're in deep. Mr. Shush has his
Shush,
paws.
I know, I love it. The mob
his paws all over that. Yeah, and I think that Colson Whitehead is showing a very strong mastery for kind of the synecdoche or metonymy that you need to do with these things, a sort of recognition that the reader probably doesn't. These things need merely to be hinted at to some degree because this is pastiche. We're operating in a kind of, corrupt, bureaucratic, detective story, crime novel genre. So you don't have to explain everything. People are kind of familiar with that genre enough. But then you can also tell that there's enough going on that it's not going to feel like a formulaic version of them. I mean, the fact that it's not a murder department, it's not an insurance investigator, they're elevator inspectors, and the fact that we're looking at the very earliest phases of racial integration in a corrupt city, like already there's already enough twists to show us that this is a little bit different than anything like that we've read before.
Yeah, and I think what's so fun about it is that you're exactly right. Like, there's enough things that are recognizable that we feel grounded in the world through that. Like, I love that he never names that it's New York, but it's so clearly New York. And I really feel like this, in one of our summer reading episodes, talking about The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson, that is a book about alternate realities. And I feel like this particular world, Earth, whatever, is our world, but for some reason, he's twisted a little bit in such a way that instead of the internet or the gramophone or the radio or baseball or something like that, the world has been obsessed with elevators. And
is it that the world is obsessed with elevators, or is it that we're just living in the characters who happen to be obsessed with elevators?
Maybe, but there does seem to be this sort of liturgical attention to this thing that keeps getting called verticality.
Yeah.
And very quickly you begin realizing, I know that I'm always like the one who's searching for like metaphor and allegory. But like it's so obvious that this concept of verticality, yes, it is about the actual physical growing of buildings, but that there's really something about social mobility that is just wrapped around all of the ideas here. And he's managing to pull off what is essentially a like comic novel and like serious racial satire and I think noir. And like, yeah, it's so funny that you brought up Dashiell Hammett. Like, as soon as we got to meet Mr. Reed with his sort of like cane tapping, not really looking her in the face, I was like, oh my God, it's Gutman from the Maltese Falcon. Like, just that same kind of over the top, well, you've been set up, kid. And so what you were going to do, your name's going to be cleared and, you'll be back at work on Monday. And she's like, no, I won't, because I'm going to go find the black box. And I was like, this is great. Like, we're just like, we're off to this is hitting everything I want this to be. It's like Michael Chabon crossed with Dashiell Hammett, crossed with like a bunch of other marvelous stuff, all done in service of what I'm pretty sure is like a really strong piece of racial satire. I've got Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal pulled up because I think Dickens is a great parallel, and I think Swift is the other parallel. Because really those are the two great satirical writers of their time doing a very similar thing. I think Swift is probably a little bit more in Colson Whitehead's vein in that he is taking a recognizable world and twisting it slightly. But, I mean, I'm not going to malign Dickens in any particular way.
Right. Do you want to read some of the Swift?
Yeah, for sure. And the reason I thought of this is, like, Swift has not the same diction, but you really have to keep track of what's happening in each sentence. That's kind of the joy of this novel, is like these glittering sentences. But let's just do the first two paragraphs of A Modest Proposal. This shouldn't take me too long. Okay. So this is 1729, A Modest Proposal. It is a melancholy object to those who walk through this great town or travel in the country when they see the streets, the roads, and the cabin doors crowded with beggars of the female sex, followed by 3, 4, or 6 children, all in rags, and importuning every passenger for an alms. These mothers, instead of being able to work for their honest livelihood, are first to employ all their time in strolling to beg sustenance for their hapless infants who, as they grow up, either turn thieves for want of work, or leave their dear native country to fight for the Pretender in Spain, or to sell themselves to the Barbados. I think it is agreed by all parties that this prodigious number of children in the arms, or on the backs, or at the heels of their mothers, and frequently of their fathers, is in the present deplorable state of the kingdom a very great additional grievance, and therefore whoever could find out a fair, cheap, and easy method of making these children sound and useful members of the Commonwealth would deserve so well of the public as to have his statue set up for a preserver of the nation. Spoiler alerts coming for Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal. Dr. Swift sets himself up as that particular person who is going to come up with a solution and then have a statue of himself set up. But his solution is that what we do with these 3 or 4 or 6 infants trailing after their mothers and sometimes their fathers, it's the little asides with Swift that are the ones you got to pay attention to, is that we should cook them and eat them and use their skin for leather products all throughout the country. As with many great satirical pieces of work, about 20% of the reading population got it. and about 80% of the reading population, we're quickly crying out for Jonathan Swift's, execution and excommunication. Right. But the real killer of A Modest Proposal, after he lists all of the ways that eating babies and using their skin for leather products is the way to go, he employs a really strong rhetorical device of, other people say that the thing that should be done for these children of Irish mothers is that they should be fed and educated. And that person is so obviously not in touch with the realities of this king. And he's just like, and he like slips in the actual solution as his straw man. And I really feel like that is happening all the time in this book. This kind of like, well, we couldn't possibly do things that would be, fair and equal in terms of verticality. And I'm just really, really enjoying the kind of high wire act of this. What I really think is a piece of like incredibly powerful satire.
Yeah, and it makes me think how hard that would be to do today. I mean, of course, apparently it's always been hard, right? And it's a frustrating thing for the literary wag, right? Because you don't want to give it away too much, because the joke is funnier if you don't break character. But then again, not everybody is literary enough to pick up the winks. And so if you're trying to have an impact and win people to the side of your argument, it can be hard to do it. And it's really funny to me, as somebody who lurks on Twitter, how often I feel like irony is missed in the world. And I don't know what to make of it exactly, other than I wish we were a little bit more literate, because I think it's often there. It's often the writer is saying the person who figures this out should get a statue. That's sort of similar to saying, like, apart from my modesty, my sense of humor is my greatest quality. To me, it's such an obvious setup. Now, of course, the fact that like we recently had a president who would say things like that unironically does confound and confuse the issue, but you have to know something about the speaker, I suppose, in order to parse the irony.
That's kind of my question here about tone of voice. Like, I was thinking like one thing that might be fun to do here and there with this show is every now and then, like, we get a piece of writing that really, really helps show off a literary device. And I think tone is so often confused with mood and atmosphere that I think that this book here is a really good way into talking about tone of voice. What would you describe this narrator's tone of voice? Like, how if you heard this person sort of speaking on like a sidewalk preacher or something like that, how would you describe this speaker's tone of voice?
Okay, did you watch The Wire?
Yes.
Okay, do you remember in the newspaper scene, there's kind of like an old copy editor who everybody brings their copy to, and he sort of, pulls out his reading glasses and takes a look at it and says, 52 people were not evacuated. At least I don't think that their innards, were then resplendent upon the streets of Baltimore. I think what you mean to say is the building was evacuated. And there's something of that. There's something of the kind of soft-spoken but carries a big literary stick quality.
Yeah.
A wry observer, a very bright man who can do the Saturday New York Times crossword in about a half an hour while drinking Guinness at the Irish pub and talking to his friends. That to me is the tone of it is a wry observer who's and this is where I get Dickens too, where Dickens, I remember at one point where he's talking about the various prostitutes, and I can't remember, I think it's in Oliver Twist, and refers to one character saying that she would be blessed before she would do the thing that one of the other characters is asking her to do. And of course, he's saying she's swearing she would be damned, which was a much worse for most people swear at the time because it was blasphemy than it appears to us today. So Dickens basically using elevated, ironic language to actually suggest something a lot lower and a lot more disreputable. I think the reading I have queued actually will speak to this, so I may transition into it.
Yeah.
But that is that is the voice that I'm hearing, and I also think that there's a particular African American quality to it in the sense of a kind of ironic remixing of the language of the oppressor.
Yeah.
But with love, right? Here is a writer who's read probably Dickens and Jonathan Swift with great joy and is taking a kind of elevated, high tone. He's not writing in working class speech. He's writing in sort of literary speech, but he's talking about matters of concern to the working man and the working woman, and to the oppressed person, and doing it with a kind of wry irony throughout.
Yeah.
So this is. We've learned that the municipal building has in fact been named after Fanny Briggs, who's sort of like Harriet Tubman. And we've learned that Lila May, as a child, did a kind of like book report or presentation on Fanny Briggs after hearing a famous black actress read a monologue of Fanny Briggs on the radio. And so the first thing we hear is a sort of description of her as a young girl listening to that on the radio, and then it kind of gets bigger. So this is Lila May listening to the radio as a kid. The actress's voice was iron and strong and did not fail to summon applause from the more liberal quarters of her audience, who remembered about noble struggle. Tiny particles of darkness pressed beyond the cracked, weedy mesh of the speaker, the kind of unsettling darkness Lila May would later associate with the elevator well. Of course, she would do her oral report on Fanny Briggs. Who else was there? Now, she's also driving in traffic right now, too, as she's remembering this. Not much progress in this traffic, but times are changing. In a city with an increasingly vocal colored population who are not above staging tiresome demonstrations for the lowly or tabloids or throwing tomatoes and rotten cabbages doing otherwise perfectly orchestrated speeches and rallies, it only makes sense to name the new municipal building after one of their heroes. The mayor is not stupid. You don't become the ruler of a city this large and insane by being stupid. The mayor is shrewd and understands that this city is not a southern city. It's not an old money city or a new money city, but the most famous city in the world. And the rules are different here. The new municipal building has been named the Fanny Briggs Memorial Building, and there have been few complaints and fewer tomatoes.
Okay, to continue our sort of analysis of tone, what is this speaker's attitude about this particular situation? What is the speaker's attitude about the mayor, about the colored population? What is this speaker saying without saying it?
So the speaker is sympathetic to the black population, but he is writing it from the perspective of the power brokers and the mayor. So he's describing the black demonstrators as tiresome, disrupting otherwise perfectly orchestrated speeches, tiresome demonstration for the lowly or the tabloids. And the mayor is described as being shrewd enough to realize that this isn't a southern city, this isn't a new money city, that this is a constituency that you have to kind of pacify, and you got to throw them a bone. So we're going to go ahead and he's writing it from the perspective of the mayor perhaps talking to one of his fellow power brokers, a wealthy donor or a kind of, no man, a kind of Secretary of State type. But he's pushing the language a little bit more than somebody in that position would. And also the fact that our protagonist is a black woman helps us understand that the narrator is sympathetic.
And what are the words that clue you into that reading? Like, how do you pull that out of there and be like, oh, this is because it's complicated, right? Satire is so complicated. Like, very often it's ironic.
Yeah.
And so first we have to sort out, okay, who's the target? Who is the butt of the joke? And I think in this case, the mayor is the butt of the joke.
The mayor and his ilk.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what. Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be something like, and his feathered ilk or his tuxedoed ilk or something.
His brethren,
something like that.
Right.
So we have to figure out who the butt of the joke is, and then the attitude here is this kind of like muffled, not rage, but certainly like this isn't fair. Like, this isn't right. The way that their demonstrations are called tiresome. But how do you work your way through this thicket of irony and satire to understand what's being said?
It's a great question. And I mean, I think this is like irony 101, and it's hard. I mean, I think that, a lifelong reader develops a kind of intuitionist like antenna where you're not even necessarily aware of how you're picking it up. You just are aware. So you're asking actually something that's kind of challenging. But I do think part of it is the positionality of what we know about the positionality of the writer and who the protagonist is. If the protagonist was the mayor, a heroic, waspy, talented political figure trying to use bold leadership to bring this city into the 20th century and having to knit together all sorts of troublesome constituencies, then maybe it would be harder to pick that up. But we know
it sounds like you're describing like an Ayn Rand novel at this point.
With
the same problems with an Ayn Rand novel.
Indeed. Although, I mean, you have, like, you could think of the nonfiction work of Robert Caro, right? Which is both critical but also marveling at the capacity of two great power brokers, Lyndon Johnson and Robert Moses, and this is a very Robert Moses feeling sort of book in the same way that Motherless Brooklyn, at least the movie, was. But then I think the other thing that's happening is that the adjectives are kind of turned up to 11 a little bit. If we were supposed to be sympathizing with the mayor, I don't know that the mayor would be thinking, and his ilk would be describing the demonstrations as tiresome for the lowly or the tabloids, because that sounds a bit classist, doesn't it? And wouldn't necessarily be describing the speech as otherwise perfectly orchestrated speech, right? That sounds a little bit complainy and whiny. Like, I went out and was about to deliver this perfectly orchestrated speech, and these tiresome Negroes started throwing tomatoes at me. That sounds classist and whiny. The mayor is shrewd, so it's also very complimentary of the mayor. You don't become the ruler of a city this large and insane by being stupid. So he's at once insulting the constituents and praising the mayor in his own mind. It's not a southern city, so we're othering other places. It's not an old money city, we're othering old money. Or a new money city, it's othering new money, but the most famous city in the world. And now we're celebrating the power broker at the helm of this particular city. So it is overly generous, to the point of comically generous, to the butt of the joke. And it is overly exaggeratedly insulting of all of these other forces and factors that he has to contend with. And I think that's how we pick it up. And then there's also the sort of, there's the sort of callback of the complaints and the tomatoes, the poetic, there have been few complaints and fewer tomatoes. There's a rhythmic callback to that too, that sort of suggests that there's something playful in the language as well. But yeah, what did I miss?
No,
Professor?
I think you nailed it. This is definitely one of my bugaboos about the confusion of tone with mood. And I get it. I understand, because the word tone has come to mean a lot of different things, and especially I think the inclusion of the word tone as something that we do with our audio devices has sort of washed over into like, oh, tone is the same as mood. And mood is the overarching emotional feeling of a literary work. If we're talking about Tess of the D'Urbervilles, you might say that there's kind of a like huge, glowering, foreboding feeling of that entire novel. Because it is. Every single page you're kind of like, oh, something bad is going to happen. And it does. But tone is the author's attitude towards his or her subject material. And I really think that, you're really working through. I mean, the word shrewd is such a perfect choice, because it is both complimentary and it's a little pejorative. Like, shrewd, it can be deployed in a kind of winking, like, oh, that is a shrewd person. It's not 100% positive. You're not saying that is a smart person.
Another thing, too, now that I'm thinking about it, and I had thought about bringing this up in another context, and I will share that context, which is I do a lot of my work right now is editing, and basically helping writers write in greater accordance with what they're actually trying to express. And one of my impulses as an editor is to remove adjectives, especially adjectives that are not things like red or, above. I guess above is sort of a preposition, but red or, southern or extremely objective and not very laden with value and tone, because, for a couple of reasons. And one is that people just tend to overwrite sentences, and people have this sense that literary beautiful writing is florid, purple sentences like, the dappled light meandered its way through the effervescent green maples of early spring and played upon the diaphanous gown of the young maiden. And that's crappy writing. But it's people great. When there are people, anytime you're using diaphanous, probably pull it out.
You get one, everybody.
Well, but also, if you're going to use an adjective, I think there are a couple lessons from this. And one is use a very, very specific adjective in a very, very specific way. So the cracked, weedy mesh, the speaker.
What a description.
It is a beautifully descriptive. Now, if you were to say the austere mesh of the speaker, or you were to say the stately mesh of the speaker, those are a little bit vague. I mean, maybe you could get away with it a little bit, but I
could see austere mesh of the speaker if it's like if this is like a loving article about Kraftwerk, could really see the austere mesh of the speaker showing up and fitting perfectly in there. But what you're talking about is suiting your diction to your project.
Right. And not use, there are a lot of adjectives people use that are sort of like, basically you're just trying to say good, but you don't want to say good, so you're sort of like dynamic, a real dynamic group. That they're adjectives that actually are making what you're saying increasingly vague. And it would be better to just be descriptive. And I think the other thing in this particular case of satire is he's using a lot of adjectives: tiresome, orchestrated, famous, rotten. Rotten's a good one in this particular case, but I think that's also part of the clue to the irony, which is to say, if these things were really true, this mayor and his ilk wouldn't need to be using the adjectives. They would be simply apparent. So the fact that we're using so many adjectives is also a sense that there's some spin going on here, that somebody is self-aggrandizing or somebody is doing politics or somebody is doing bullshit. And in fact, all of these things are happening. And, maybe the mayor is shrewd, but still, this is a political creature who's paying more attention to appearances than the substance. It's not necessarily saying that a burning lust for justice is what led to the Fanny Briggs Memorial Building getting that name, that somebody recognized that this might make a particular constituency just a little bit less likely to throw rotten tomatoes, and sure enough, it did. And
it did, but probably has not assuaged the issue that led to the desire to throw tomatoes in the first place.
Indeed. I mean, it is something of a Band-Aid. It is
exactly.
It is something,
yeah.
It's something of a cosmetic addressing of the topic.
I want to return to Swift for a second, just because I really think it's the same kind of thing that we're talking about. This is the section I was talking about like him bringing up the other possible solutions to the problem. So we've gotten to this point through his 6 to 7 different benefits of how you should eat, why we should be eating Irish babies. But here we go. I can think of no one objection that will be possibly raised against this proposal, unless it should be urged that the number of people will be thereby much lessened in the kingdom. This I freely own, and was indeed one principal design in offering to the world. I desire the reader will observe that I calculate my remedy for this one individual kingdom of Ireland, and for no other that ever was, is, or, I think, ever can be upon earth. Therefore, let no man talk to me of other expedients, of taxing our absentees at 5 shillings a pound, of using neither clothes nor household furniture, except what is our own growth and manufacture, of utterly rejecting the materials and instruments that promote foreign luxury, of curing the expensiveness of pride, vanity, idleness, and gaming in our people, of introducing a vein of parsimony, prudence, and temperance, of learning to love our country. I mean, those are like several very good expedients to fixing the problem of poverty in your country, especially the curing the expensiveness of pride, vanity, idleness, and gaming in our people. Swift does have. Yeah, exactly. Swift does have a little bit of. There's a little flavor of the conservative in him, but this is mostly a brilliant example of what we're talking about like how do you get across a message to a population that just won't listen. And I really think that Colson Whitehead is coming out guns a-blazing in this debut novel.
Guns a-blazing, but with silencers.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
I mean, it's strong. Like there is a really, I mean, I would say the tone of voice is the tone here is muffled rage.
Right. Yeah, I'm imagining the sly middle-aged man at the end of the bar kind of commenting with some taking pleasure in the disgust, somebody who is a deep cynic. Whose cynicism is well earned because he's been around the block, and that's impressive for such a young. I think he was a pretty young writer when this came out too, probably in his 30s, if not 20s. But structural racism ages you, I presume, or at least it ages your mind. Let's hear about the perfect lift. Actually,
okay, I think I'm gonna switch. I'm gonna go. I had 2 readings queued up here. The mural on page 47, which is also in the Fanny Briggs Memorial Building. Okay. The lobby of the Fanny Briggs Memorial Building was almost finished when she arrived. As if to distract from the minuscule and cramped philosophy of what would transpire on the floors above, the city offered visitors the spatial bounty of the lobby. The ersatz marble was firm underfoot like real marble, sheer and produced trembling echoes effortlessly. The circle of Doric columns braced the weight above without complaint. The mural, however, was not complete. It started out jauntily enough to Lila May's left. Cheerless Indians holding up a deerskin in front of a fire. The original tenants, sure. A galleon negotiating the tricky channels around the island. 2 beaming Indians trading beads to a gang of white men. The infamous sale of the island. Big moment, have to include that. The first of many dubious transactions in the city's history. They didn't have elevators yet. That's why the scenes look so flat to Lila May. The city is dimensionless. The mural jumped to the revolution then, she noticed, skipped over a lot of stuff. The painter seemed to be making it up as he went along, like the men who shaped the city. The revolution scene was a nice set piece, the colonists pulling down the statue of King George III. They melted it down for ammunition, if she remembers correctly. It's always nice when a good mob comes together. The painting ended there.
Yeah.
Man, that's good.
Well, and it merges the irony of the narrator's voice with, I mean, you're merging it with Lila May's voice, too. It's almost like they're the same in that moment. Why did you pick that?
I picked it because I really, the thing I'm really enjoying about this book is the combination of this kind of like Chabon-esque literary like flights of fancy and the technical brilliance of the prose combined with a real kind of social satire. We have so many pieces of great social satire. I've brought up American Psycho before. But one of the problems with like American Psycho, if we're going to pick a target to satirize, like 1980s Wall Street excess is pretty easy. It's a great book and it really handles that subject excellently. But like the way that passage does things like, a little like, many dubious transactions happened in the history of the island. I mean, it's just this marvelous, like, again, it's this great piece of like tone, but we're really starting to hear, and there's that little bit about the city was dimensionless. Yeah. We're starting to learn that one of the things that is really valued in this world is this kind of vertical movement. He's taking this idea of like social upward mobility and making it a literal denotative thing. He's the elevators are capital S symbols for moving vertically in the social structures of the world. And of course, given what we're seeing about the racial plight of black people in this world and what we know about the racial plight of people of color in our world, is that verticality is essentially denied to them. And we get all of that with the grumpy Indians, then the beaming Indians who are getting, bilked out of their land, all wrapped up in this piece of scene setting as well. He's doing so many things at once in so many passages in this book. It's it's the kind of book that makes you despair about writing. Some authors make you want to run to your keyboard, and Colson Whitehead makes me worried to ever write a sentence ever again.
Yeah. Don't give up.
No. I'm sure. No, we shouldn't. We shouldn't ever give up.
I'm sure Colson Whitehead writes a lot of clunkers too.
It
for
is sure.
A craft.
Yeah.
But I think there's another thing I want to talk about, but I think because of the time, we should talk about it next time. And I think it relates to thinking versus feeling, but I also think it relates to the verticality, and I also think it relates to the question of why Lila May wants to go after the black box too. Yeah. Because I think there's actually a broader concept here that is beyond. Sure, it is pretty easy to make the comparison. I mean, the term in black newspapers in the early 20th century for what a race man does, meaning somebody who is a hero in the black community is to uplift the race. That was the term that was, W.E.B. Du Bois and others. You read that
marvelous.
a lot. Uplift the race. And so, it clearly seems like that's part of it. But I think the test will be, will Lila May find the black box? I suspect probably so. Otherwise, it would be kind of a boring story. What will she do with it?
Yeah.
I think will be the test, and I think that's going to be a very interesting question for the latter half of the book.
Do you want to move to trivia?
Sure.
This book talks about and even dramatizes Elijah Otis, the inventor of the safety elevator. So elevators that if they encounter a mishap will be stopped in their tracks by something without plummeting to their doom.
Right.
What was the first vertical, not a funicular, counterweighted human-powered elevator? Was it A, London Bridge, not to be confused with Tower Bridge, the big one, burned down in the 17th century? It was rebuilt during Charles II's reign. And he had a rudimentary suspension system built into the bridge that featured a small elevator that traveled up and down with the drawbridge. B, Emperor Taizu of the Qing dynasty ordered an elevator built towards the end of his life, also in the early 17th century, so he could travel between floors of the palace without having to be littered there, because he was vain and didn't want to be seen carried around in his dotage. Or was it C, Louis XV had one installed in Versailles so he could surreptitiously visit his mistress, whose apartments were on the second floor of the palace?
So clarify, what are we defining as an elevator? Or do you have a working definition of an elevator? Because I'm just imagining, block and tackle, like lifting a painter up,
of course,
and that being something that would happen much earlier than that, I think.
The definition here of these particular elevators is that they're counterweighted. So that they are going to be able to travel up and down with really not
very
the
little
attendant, necessary for power.
Okay, so the options are London Bridge, Qing Dynasty, Empire, Emperor, or Louis.
Yeah.
I think that Louis was not concerned about whether or not anybody saw him visiting his mistresses. I don't know about London Bridge, but now this is interesting though, because the elevator then with the counterweight does, I believe, make more appearances in Western civilization than Eastern civilization. But I don't know, I'm just guessing. But I'm going to go with B, the Qing Dynasty Emperor.
I have written two strong falsehoods. It was Louis XV.
Ah. Wow. Interesting.
Yep.
Interesting. Yep. For some reason, and maybe maybe it's because of in Neil Stephenson's Baroque cycle, Louis is actually at pains to be thought to be having an assignation with a mistress when in fact something else is going on.
Amazing.
So maybe that's what maybe Neil Stephenson threw me off. Wow, I'm on a bit of a losing streak right now. All right. Mine is also a question about the history of vertical conveyance. However, in this case, I was inspired by good old Chuck Gould to look into the history of the escalator, which I love that this is mostly a book set in the world of elevator inspectors and elevator technologists and operators. But there's time for a little bit of escalator digression in the form of a little bit of a discussion of Chuck Gould. My question is pretty simple. Which of the following was not a name used for what we now call escalators?
Oh, I love this question.
Okay, ready? So
not a name.
A, elevator. B, endless conveyor. C, unenclosed lift. Or D, electric staircase?
I think it's either A or D. Elevator. Now my brain's trying to figure out the intersection of electricity and possible escalation. Whether those two things would be happening at the same time, or if there were any way to make an escalator that was not electric. Like if there were analog or steam or hydraulic powered escalators before electric ones. I'm going to go with A, elevator.
In fact, it is C, the unenclosed lift.
Darn it, I really wanted that one to be...
One of the earliest patents for an escalator was referred to it as an elevator, apparently. And apparently the term elevator was not... The term lift was a little bit more common at one point.
What makes sense.
Until maybe Otis came along with his safety elevator. Oh, well, so... Some tough trivia there. Those were toughies, but I do love. I love kind of like what we were getting at, the sort of broad scale and scope and depth of the intellectual, social, and cultural import of vertical conveyance in this book.
Yeah, totally. I think the attraction that we're feeling with this book is the combination of an almost laughably pedestrian experience as the backdrop and plot device of something that is much bigger and much more important.
I do think that probably we talk about the skyscraper being sort of born in Chicago and New York and really achieving the sort of height that we associate with real skyscrapers, with breakthroughs in steel and creating new steel alloys and structural. But you really wouldn't have skyscrapers without vertical conveyance. You need something like that. It's absolutely true. And they were perfected around the same time as the skyscraper. Now, I don't know if that's because the elevator was invented and then suddenly people could build taller buildings, or if they were deciding they needed to build taller buildings and realizing, well, we need a technology that will get people to the top much more quickly. Imagine it's a little bit more the latter than the former, because, if Louis XV's, personal carpenter could figure out how to make one, the basic technology is not that complicated.
Right.
I don't think.
Totally.
Counterweight.
I think we're enjoying. Yeah. I mean, like that. The enjoyment of this novel is exactly what you're describing. Is like this. Like there is this sort of cultural and social thing that's happening, and skyscrapers and building upward has always been a part of the human experience. I mean, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, pyramids, cathedrals, let's get to the heavens. I mean, just the human impulse to park your car at the side of the road and run up the nearest hill is attendant.
That, and then there's also the sort of capitalistic maximizing the value of the square footage of land in dense urban spaces. There's a famous quote that a skyscraper is a machine to make the land pay.
Nice. Glorious. Talk about tone.
Indeed.
That's a short sentence, and you can hear what the author's attitude about his subject material is in that tone. The words machine and pay and land are the things that really clue us into what is actually going, the critique that is behind that sentence.
Yeah. Although, I mean, it's interesting because I think it could be read a couple different ways. I actually think this writer was maybe marveling at that sort of, the way in which form follows function, and that the function in at least capitalist real estate design is often about making money. Where in former eras, say in a theocracy or in a feudal system, they also went high, but that was more about projecting power.
Right. That was one person got to go high.
One person got to go high, or one institution got to go high. all of that. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and tell everybody what's next, which is we're going to read the second half of this wonderful book. We're excited to see what happens. I think there's already questions developing for me about the second half, and I think Lila May's kind of motivation and what's driving her to pursue the MacGuffin is something I both intuitively understand, but also I'm really looking forward to unpacking next time.
Nice. Well, thanks for listening, everybody. Please rate and review the show. Remember, if you give us a 5-star rating, we will read your review on the air, which is really fun if you'd like us to read it on the air. And Upper Middlebrow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes approach all of this from an evenly empirical and intuitive point of view. Music is by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes, and design and website is by me, Chris Bagg. You can learn more about us at uppermiddlebrow.com or at all the places on social. We're on Twitter at uppermiddlepod. We're on Instagram at upper_middle_brow. And we would love to hear from you. Let us know what you thought about our summer reading series and where you would like us to go in the future.
Upward and onward. And one more thing I'll say is that I just got a notification today that we are the number 44 podcast in books in Sweden.
Yes.
Thank you, Sweden. Listening to Upper Middlebrow.
Amazing. I wonder how many
podcasts.
Book podcasts. Maybe we beat out 45. Maybe we're.
Yeah, that's the most important thing. Who's below us?
Exactly.
Who are we on top of now? Indeed. Hello, folks. Before we let you go, I have a quick update. We are planning a live Upper Middlebrow draft very soon. The draft is our process for picking out our next series of books or other cultural production that we're going to watch or read and talk about for the podcast. So that will be this Wednesday, August 3rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We're still working on the logistics of how we're going to do that live, so stay tuned to our social media channels or check the blog at uppermiddlebrow.com. We expect to have instructions posted by Tuesday evening the 2nd. And a reminder, Chris and I are both writers and editors, and we can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project. We are not cheap, but we are reasonably priced, and we are very good. You can see our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, chrisbagg.com, and I'm happy to announce that jessedukes.com is back after a many-year hiatus. So check them both out. Get in touch if you want to talk about how we can help you with your project, big or small.